Okay, welcome to MBA 507, a little supplemental article I've came across last week, and I thought of you folks in MBA 507, and it's somewhat pertinent to some of the things we've been talking about this semester. Look, if you go back to interest rates, the components, the risk-free rate of return, as measured by the not the risk-free rate of return, but the risk-free interest rate on the government bonds. And then we build things in to get to the real interest, nominal interest rate, inflation factor, a maturity factor, premium, and all those things. Did I say inflation? It's kind of late at night. I had a long day. I apologize, but everything is hooked together, or many things are hooked together in the economy, and we're seem to be on the verge of getting into some inflationary times, which we haven't seen for quite a while, 20 years maybe, maybe more. I guess the 1990s, last time we had any significant inflation. So there's this book really doesn't get into it, but the Federal Reserve has a big impact on things. And they are charged with two things, really, setting monetary policy and fiscal policy. And most people, the vast majority, I would expect somewhere in the 90 percentile of the American public does not know the difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. So let's get those two definitions clear first. Monetary policy refers to the actions of the central banks to achieve macroeconomic policy objectives such as price stability, full employment, and stable economic growth. Fiscal policy refers to the tax and spending policies of the federal government. Fiscal policy decisions are determined by Congress and the administration. The Federal Reserve plays no role in determining fiscal policy. Okay. But it does have an impact. Okay. The U.S. Congress establishes maximum employment and price stability objectives for the Federal Reserve. They are sometimes referred to as the Federal Reserve's dual mandate. Apart from those overreaching objectives, the Congress determines that operational conduct of monetary policy should be free from political influence. Yeah, right. As a result, the Federal Reserve is the independent agency of the federal government. Yeah, and who appoints the chairman, the president? Plus, the president and Congress can bring public pressure to bear on the Federal Reserve's actions. The Federal Reserve uses a variety of policy tools to foster its statutory objectives of maximum employment and price stability. Price stability is the opposite of inflation or deflation. Its main policy tools is the target for federal funds rate, the overnight rate banks charge each other for short-term loans, extremely short-term loans. The Federal Reserve's control over the federal funds rate gives it the ability to influence the general level of short-term market interest rates. By adjusting the level of short-term interest rates in response to changes in the economic outlook, the Federal Reserve can influence longer-term interest rates and keep asset prices. These changes in financial conditions then affect the spending decisions of households and businesses. The monetary policy making body within the Federal Reserve System is the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC. It currently has 8 scheduled meetings per year during which it reviews economic and financial developments and determines the appropriate stance on monetary policy. Monetary policy is basically how much money can they print. Okay, supply and demand will affect the value of what the money can buy, the purchasing power. In reviewing the economic outlook, the Federal Open Market Committee considers how the current and projected paths of the fiscal policy might affect key macroeconomic variables such as gross domestic product, employment rate, rates of inflation. In this way, fiscal policy has an indirect effect on the conduct of monetary policy through the influence on the aggregate economy and the economic outlook. For example, if the federal tax and spending programs are projected to boost economic growth, the Federal Reserve would assess how those programs would affect its key macroeconomic objectives, maximum employment and price stability, and make appropriate adjustments to its monetary policy tools. Okay, so here's the change that came about. August 2020, the U.S. Federal Reserve rolled out a new approach to its monetary policy. At the time, the U.S. economy was reeling from the coronavirus pandemic, and the Federal Reserve was still focused on its aggressive response to that collapse. But the new framework has taken on greater importance as growth has returned. Under the new strategy, the labor market will be allowed to run hotter, and that could help lower-income workers and members of minority groups who sometimes haven't fully benefited from periods of economic growth. Again, this is kind of scary because the last couple of years I've been reading, and over in Europe, they've been trying it with a guaranteed minimum income. All it is a wealth redistribution. Take from the old Robin Hood syndrome. Take from the rich, tax the rich, and give to the poor. What is the Federal Reserve's job? It's to manage the economy to produce both price stability and full employment. Its main tool is interest rate, the federal funds rate. Okay. Let's see. It raises the rate to slow economic activity, and it lowers it to stimulate it. Financing. If rates are low, people are going to buy houses, they're going to buy cars, they're going to buy things. Businesses are going to buy new tools and invest. They're going to expand because money is cheap. When the economy is overheating and they bring on inflation, the Federal Reserve attempts to cool it off by raising interest rates. So people, think about it. When rates are low, are you happy with your 1% or less in the bank? No, you're going to put money into stocks and bonds. When interest rates go up at the banks, they're guaranteed, up to $200,000 or $300,000 by the FDIC. So it's low risk, it's a guaranteed rate, and it's an attractive high rate. People are going to dump their investments in stocks and bonds, which are riskier than putting your money in the bank. But the rates are going to be happy with the 6, 7, 8, 10%. And in my lifetime, I've seen it as high as 16, 17%. That was back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I remember that because my mortgage was over 17%. Now, I also had certificates of deposit in the bank that were paying me 10 or 12%. Okay, and the stock market was flat. So where do you put your money? You put your money where you're going to get the best return. Okay, so this is one way the Federal Reserve impacts, I was going to say control, or attempts to control, and they do a pretty good job. People, financial managers watch interest rates. Everybody, well, not everybody, but everybody should watch interest rates and make decisions accordingly. When do you borrow money? You borrow money when it's cheap. Well, sometimes you have to borrow it when you need it. But if you had your druthers, you would rather borrow it at lower interest rates than at higher interest rates. Just common logic. Why do we need a new framework? Before the pandemic, the Federal Reserve decided it wanted to learn from the difficulties it had encountered during the last recovery, that being the meltdown of the credit markets in 2008 and subsequent recovery or semi-recovery are around 2012/2013. So it's always, you make mistakes, you want to learn from your errors. It had never managed to bring inflation consistently up to 2%, since making that its target in 2012, right after the recession of 2008. And its employment projections have been wrong time and time again. So what's it doing on inflation? It will now pursue an average 2% rate, and the average is in quotes, meaning it will let inflation overshoot the target during a recovery to make up for the periods below 2% when we were in a downturn in the economy. That is, it will tolerate somewhat higher inflation for a while to make sure that annual gains settle around 2% over. And again, I guess I want to do this so we don't have costs to be narrow and somewhat consistent. How about employment? How does that get impacted? The Federal Reserve is jettisoning its practice of raising rates as soon as forecasts suggest that the labor market is headed toward overheating. That growing demand for workers could spark inflation by driving up wages. Well, what do we have now with the bailouts, with the payments to people? People don't want to work. And the president last week told the one guy whose business was suffering, he said, pay your employees more. Easy for him to do it. He can print money. The business owner can't. He can only afford to pay what the revenues and his normal profit markup allows him to pay for labor. Instead, it says it'll let unemployment continue to fall so long as inflation remains low, and will assess the labor market in terms of shortfalls from full employment. Well, I think last week they were shocked that the new claims for unemployment were 400 or 500 than they had expected. Of course, that unemployment rate is a funny thing. They keep changing how they compute it for political purposes. So it's an indicator, but it's not a solid one, because if you're talking about unemployment rate from a couple of years ago, it's computed completely different than it is now. So it lacks comparability from period to period. Okay, so what's this all mean? The Federal Reserve's success in conquering the double-digit inflation of the late 1970s. What did I say? My mortgage was 17%. It was early 80s. Late 70s, early 80s, created a legacy that the Federal Reserve chairwomen sought to protect. Labor advocates have long argued that in doing so, it has neglected its mandate to promote job creation, and in many ways, the Fed is agreeing. Its policy keeps inflation subdued, but costs working Americans the higher wages and better employment opportunities that would come from decades of stronger growth. What good is it if you make more money, but it costs you more to put gas in your car, and more for a loaf of bread and to feed your family, more to pay for your mortgage? Actually, if you look at it from my viewpoint as an accountant, what does higher wages do? It puts you in a higher tax bracket. So you not only get penalized with the inflationary increase in cost of all the things you need in life, food, shelter, and clothing, but you actually end up, you have more dollars, but those dollars buy less, and you're in a higher tax bracket, so your actually take-home purchasing power is less. Again, we do a very poor job in this country of education, and extremely poor job in this country when it comes to education about economics. A lot of social ills could be avoided and reduced if we did a better job of teaching people how to budget and live within their means, and use an education and hard work to get ahead. Personal commentary there. How's that? As part of the new framework, the Federal Reserve describes full employment as a broad-based and inclusive goal. Boy, is that ambiguous. So they can make it whatever. They make a definition like that, so whatever they want to do, they can fit the numbers into it, giving it an ambiguous computation like that. That's shorthand for looking not just at the aggregate unemployment rate, but at the labor market indicators for different segments of the population, including Black unemployment. In contrast, the Fed, using its traditional approach, raised interest rates in December 2015 for the first time since the 2008 financial crisis, in part because the overall unemployment rate was 5%, close to where the Fed has its estimate of full employment, around 4.5%, 5%. They don't think they can ever get it down to zero. Okay. But Black unemployment was 8.5%, according to the revised data. Well, they revised that, but did they ever revise the other full employment number, or the actual unemployment rate? Taking that gap into consideration could help reduce racial inequality. What's the reaction been? There's been no end of questions, and not just in the U.S. The interest rate decisions of the Federal Reserve ripple around the globe. Again, we may have the biggest economy, or maybe the Chinese are bigger than us, so we have the second biggest economy. But again, we're a consumer nation, so we drive a lot of other countries' economies are dependent on us to buy their goods. Some of the questions have to do with the wiggle room or discretion that the Federal Reserve officials have left themselves. Instead of laying out quantitative metrics on inflation, for instance, the new policy states that inflation will be allowed to overshoot 2% for some time. Again, ambiguous. Second, a post-pandemic boom fueled by unprecedented stimulus from both the Fed and Congress is pushing prices up for all kinds of goods and services. Bond investors wonder if inflation might take on a life of its own. That's a scary thing on the horizon. I saw some numbers today for, I forget what the exact thing was, but one of them was gasoline was up 40% increase over a year ago. Everybody needs gasoline. Even if you think about it, it's not just gasoline. You're talking diesel fuel. It's going to cost you more for a ticket to airplane because they use aviation gas. It's high octane gas. Everything you get in the stores comes to you by truck. If you don't buy from a store, you're buying online. Amazon has a fleet of trucks. Of course, Bezos has a agreement with Rivian to do electric delivery vans. They haven't gotten them yet. I think I saw something on that note. I was looking at them because I noticed had one of their vehicles taking the astronauts with Bezos, the one up with Bezos, were in a Rivian. And I'm saying, well, how can, yeah, he's got one because he's got an in with the company. They're not available to the public yet. They were supposed to be out this summer, but now they said maybe sometime in 2022 they're going to be selling them. They have a truck and an SUV, a pickup truck and an SUV scheduled out for the public to compete with Tesla. Somewhat with Tesla, it's Cybertruck and Model X. How has the Fed responded? Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, and he was a Trump appointee, repeatedly described the sign, and again, there's appointed for, a 4-year or 6-year term, repeatedly described the signs of inflation as transitory, tied to supply bottlenecks that are temporary, and points to the millions of workers who remain out of work. Powell and other Federal Reserve leaders. The Federal Reserve is made up from, there's a bunch of districts across the country, New York, Boston, Chicago, LA, Dallas, Texas, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. And each one of those regions has a Federal Reserve Bank, and the head of that bank is called the governor. And they meet, and they have a lot of power. And they talk about all these good things that affect our lives. And that 99.9% of America have no idea that these people even exist, let alone the power they have to influence our lives. Powell and other Federal Reserve leaders have shown total commitment to the framework despite the data swings and a certain amount of financial market volatility. Risk, right? Volatility, uncertainty, risk. That's one of the things we've talked about. They're also on guard against the mistake they made in 2015, tightening too early before the labor market gains reached lower income workers. The black unemployment rate in May 2021 was 9.1%, down from the pandemic peak of 16.7%, but still well above the pre-pandemic low of 5.2%, let alone the white pre-pandemic low of 3%. Okay, that's about it on that article on the Federal Reserve. Hopefully you got some knowledge out of it and maybe a little bit better understanding. So hope you enjoyed it. I don't think I'm going to have any exam questions based on it. But again, just to pique your interest, and maybe you can go read a book on it between the end of the summer semester and the beginning of the fall semester. Or at least when you see something on the financial radio, TV, hear on the radio, see on TV, or see it in the Wall Street Journal or some other business magazine, you now know a little bit about it. So, oh, I remember what that, yeah, Federal Reserve, market, monetary policy and fiscal policy. So Important things, even though a lot of Americans are unaware that the things even exist, let alone how much influence they have over our lives. Okay.